Welcome back to Robot Roundup. Today we're building the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. Is he really a robot? Well, he's a man made of metal, and that's good enough for me. Ready? Let's go. I start by taking some sketches and refining the character with a graphics program. I'll use this design as a blueprint for the build. You can't build a Tin Man without a bit of tinfoil. Yeah, I know it's aluminum. I'll take a rough aluminum foil ball and start layering on some super sculpty firm clay. I build up the layers until it's the right size and shape, and then smooth out the edges. I'll make sure it's nice and smooth so that I can start roughing it up again. I give it a hammered texture with a ball tool. Then I go into it with a sculpting tool and add a few small dents and scratches. Clay works really well for making worn out, dented metal. Once I'm happy with the texture, I'll bake it and use the cured base for additional details. The drawing has a very stylized jaw. I like to draw characters in a flat, cartooning style, but it sometimes takes a bit more work to translate that into 3D. So I redrew it to wrap around the sides of the head, and I use this as a template to cut a clay piece. I'll do a test fit and some stretching and pulling adjustments. I end up shaving the sides a bit thinner. I'll add the same dents and wear texture that I did for the rest of the head. I'm using Sculpey clay adhesive to help bond the uncured clay to what was already baked. It has about the consistency of white glue. I add some little bolts to the side, and it's starting to remind me a bit of the Iron Giant. The nose is pretty simple. I'll roll and taper a bit of clay and cut it to match the spec. But for the eyes, I decided to make them a bit larger than the drawing. I'll cut out some circles and then wrap a clay strip around the edge. I'll leave the seam line where the ends connect. Then I add a tiny circle slice as a pupil. I need the eyes to face more forward, otherwise they'll kind of look wall-eyed. So I'm adding some connecting pieces that correct for that angle of the head and then allow the eyes to sit more forward. I really like how this turned out. I'll cut a seam line with a scribing tool. Use a thick piece of adhesive foam as a guide. In order to get a clean line, you have to do multiple light passes. Then I'll take off the tape and finish it with a few more passes. I'll attempt to add his funnel hat by sculpting it directly on the head. Try to keep the flat shape and add the circular edge. I take a thin layer of clay and wrap it around a tapered file to make the little pipe piece. I bake it separately and then insert it into the cone. I'm not liking the angle of the cone, so I start shaving off the sides. It was at this point that I decided to scrap it and try a different approach. I take the length of the cone side and make a circle with that radius. I cut out a paper template and fold it until it's the right size cone. Then I break out my trusty pasta maker and roll out a thin layer of clay. Now I cut out the same cone in the clay. With trial and error, I found where to cut the edges so that they would connect at the right angle. I use the paper cone to keep the shape of the clay. And I make another cone out of a foil yogurt lid. I'll use that for final sculpting and baking. I had the same wear and tear texture as before. It's a lot quicker to cut a seam line into the soft clay. For the torso, I roll and press some more foil into a cylinder. Then I start layering on clay and filling in gaps. I'll add clay caps on the top and bottom and then bake it. Now that it's cured, I'll add a final flat layer around the outside. I roll out a thin layer of clay, then I wrap it around the cylinder body. I cut it where the ends meet. This gives it a kind of a sheet metal look. You can even incorporate the seam line. It's like a bit of a freebie. And I'll trim the excess off the top and bottom. I try to keep the texture consistent by adding the same hammering, denting, and scratching details. Then I bake it and drill holes for the neck and shoulders. In classical sculpture, there's a figure pose called contrapposto. The figure's shoulder lines are angled opposite to the hips because all the figure's weight is shifted on one foot. I'm trying to give the Tin Man this pose. For better adhesion, I scratch an attachment point on the torso and then add the piece that will hold the rod of the hips. I use some more clay adhesive and then bake the entire piece. This angle is looking pretty good. I'll roll out a thin snake of epoxy putty to add a welding seam around the base. I use a small ball tool to create the welding texture. Add some leftover putty, so I add a small back panel. A screwdriver bit notches in some venting holes. Then I clean up the outside edges. For the neck, I'll thread some thick wire through the piece. This gives it some extra support. I make some arm and leg joints by pressing two clay circles together. I make a bunch of these, hopefully more than I'll need. For some added detail, I'll add a smaller thin circle on each end and stamp a little circle inside it. Once baked, I start drilling attachment holes. This is why you always make extras. Always. Once drilled, the dowel rods snap in a little bit like Tinker Toys. I leave enough wiggle room to allow for adjusting the pose. I'll sculpt the feet into a taper, then I'll attach a pre-baked slab for the sole of the foot. Add a bit more texture to the feet because they figure they probably get more dents and scratches from walking through the forest. I taper and cut a tube shape for the top of the boot. I bake it and then wrap a thin layer around it, similar to what we did for the torso. His left leg is fully straight, so I can use a single rod with the knee joint sliding on like a bead. I drilled holes into the feet so that we could attach them with hardware, not just with glue. I glued the feet pieces together, then I drill a small hole and attach a wire peg to reinforce the joint. The feet need to be extra solid. I'll take some poster putty and stick down the straight leg, and then spend some time adjusting the pose of the bent leg. For extra support, I drilled space for a metal pin to hold the bent knee. I used JB Weld epoxy and let it cure. I used a few random bottles to hold it in place while it cured. I'm really liking how this turned out so far. I start the arms by tapering a clay tube and then adding a little dome where the fingers will attach. Because it's conical, I lightly roll it on a thin layer of clay to mark out the shape I need to cut for the outer layer. Then I wrap this thin layer around until the ends press together, which will show where I need to cut the seam. I use the blueprint to find the right drilling angles for the arm rods. For the fingers, I'm going to use beads. I'll crack open my bead box and take a quick inventory. I'll be hard pressed if these don't look like robot fingers. I'll drill holes for the finger placement, then insert a piece of thick wire that holds the bead. Off camera, I'll trim the tips of the wires so that it doesn't look so much like a terrifying claw hand. I usually use the same technique for rivets, gluing on some small rhinestones. For his axe, I cut out a rough shape and whittle the edge of the blade with my clay cutter. Do the same thing for the axe handle, and whittle it a bit more with an X-Acto knife after it's baked. I'll use a wire brush to scrape in some wood grain texture. After the axe head is baked, I drilled a hole for attaching the handle. I mark out where I want the handle to attach and use a razor saw to cut it. If you can't tell, I don't like to just glue flat pieces together. I always try to put some kind of connecting piece inside. Here I test fit a piece of twisted wire, then I'll glue it together. I try to make my characters freestanding, but because of this one's pose, I know I'm going to have to attach him to a base. I have a whole other video on making a cobblestone base, so I won't go into too much detail here. I'm basically doing the same thing, but painting it yellow. And that wraps up the assembly. I'll prime it black before painting it. I'm experimenting with a new primer. Well, that worked pretty well. With it primed black, I'll be dry brushing some metallics, starting with a dark gunmetal gray. I build the paint up in layers of dry brushing. This will add some depth, as the dents and all the scratches will stay dark, and the raised areas will pick up more of the paint. For contrast, I'm going to leave his jaw a bit darker, sort of like it's a different material or almost like a beard. I'll add a lighter layer of silver over the darker gray, but the footage looks about the same, so I'm going to leave out that step. I primed the axe brown because I wanted it to look a bit more rusty and set it apart as maybe a different metal than the Tin Man. The base is also primed with rusty brown. I start with a dull yellow ochre, also dry brushing. Then I use a lighter yellow to highlight the edges. When dry brushing, I spread out a thin layer of paint and then dab the brush all around on it. And I dab it on a paper towel so that there's just a light amount on the brush. The eyes get a few coats of an off-white color. Per usual, I'll give everything an oil wash of burnt umber. Then I'll dab off most of the excess. I add a few rust and grime color oil paints to a cardboard palette. Then I add small dabs of paint to the figure. After adding a variety of these small dabs, use a soft brush and some light downstrokes to turn them all into streaks and stains. Remember, he was stuck out in the elements for at least a year. I also give the rims of his eyes a little bit of shading. Weathering with oil paints is a bit of an add and subtract process. To me, a smoke paint is great for making oil stains. I add a few dabs in places to make him look freshly oiled. I focus mainly on the hinges and joints. For the base, I also give it a brown wash. Then I'll pick out a few bricks to make some lighter and some darker for a little bit of variation. And with that, I think we're off to see the wizard. Thanks for watching. Robots rule, and so do you. See you at the next roundup.